Recently, I've been hearing more and more people claim that the medium of anime disrespects the shoujo demographic, i.e. series targeted towards girls, and openly favors shonen, basically media catering to the interest of boys. One such argument followed the premise that few modern shoujos receive anime adaptations, while dozens of new shonens release every new season. So in this video, I intend to express my thoughts on this heated topic. But first, I would like to define a recurring formula present in many popular shoujo stories, where their plots follow an average slightly naive teenage girl who finds herself suddenly thrust into the world of elites, ending up as the object of desire to a handsome prince-like character, as well as the subject of interest/rival to a refined young blonde-haired woman. Expanding upon this, as these stories portray themes of classism, they often include an exclusive club where only the elite of the elites can attend, which often, due to favoritism, results in said shoujo protagonist becoming a reluctant member of. Examples that closely follow this mold include Aim for the Ace, Dear Brother, Glass Mask, and Fruits Basket. Another common theme of numerous shoujos involves that of females liberating themselves from controlling societies, such as how in Rose of Versailles, the protagonist's own nobleman father, after failing to produce a male heir, raised her as a boy instead, to continue the family tradition of joining the military. And much of the series' plot revolved around the lead embracing her suppressed femininity, while also learning that the nobility she strives to protect may not be as noble as she thought. Or how in Revolutionary Girl Utena, its female lead prefers to play the part of the prince rather than that of the princess, while also fighting to help her friend escape the predestined role of the Rose Bride. On that note, I should also mention that shoujos possess a propensity for incorporating gender-defying elements into their stories, such as through androgynous characters, both effeminate males and masculine women, or another recurring instance involves romantic relationships between people of the same gender. To be clear, on occasion shonens also depict both of these elements, but usually to a comedic effect, whereas shoujos almost always portray them in all seriousness. Lastly, a notable motif of shoujos regards the archetype of the fragile prince, who often associates with the color white. Examples include Yuki of Fruits Basket's fame, Sasame of Pretear, and Princess Tutu's Muto. The latter two sport white hair, while the former bears the translated name for snow. For the record, when I say fragile, I don't necessarily mean physical, as some of these characters occasionally exhibit great feats of strength. But more so, I refer to this from a mental disposition point of view, as two of these characters almost mindlessly obey whatever orders they receive from someone they deem as their superior, while the other example in his story succumbs to temptation. With the core tenets of shoujos established, I would like to compare those qualities to the structure of a relatively recent shonen in Food Wars. But first off, let me state, I'm not intending this as an insult or joke like cooking is for girls or women belong to the kitchen. I actually have a greater purpose behind all this. To begin, a brief synopsis of the plot, where after the closure of his family's humble diner due to the disappearance of his father, the protagonist of the story, Soma Yukihira, must enroll in the prestigious Totsuki Academy, a renowned culinary school where only the children of the food industry elites, or the most talented of future chefs attend. To maintain its image and weed out the weak, Totsuki forces its students to endure rigorous cooking challenges or otherwise face expulsion. And one of the people who goes the hardest on Soma, borderline sabotaging him, would be the chairman of the academy's own blonde-haired granddaughter, Erina Nakari, who by the way happens to be the newest addition to the school's student governing body, known as the Council of 10. Which comprises of the best young chefs currently attending Totsuki. So already from this description, classism check, high-status blonde-haired woman rival check, and an organization consisting of the elites check. Now, I realize that some of you might be wondering, how can Food Wars fit the shoujo mold if a straight non-yaoi-centric teenage male protagonist leads the cast? Well, to respond to that, at the beginning of the story, Soma already honed his skills to such a degree where he easily passes any cooking challenge. And for the most part, instead of experiencing growth or development himself, the plot more so uses him to mentor the naive and lacking in confidence Megumi Tatakura, a young female chef who grew up in a rustic working-class fishing community. So in a certain sense, Megumi fulfills the role of the average shoujo protagonist, while Soma plays the part of the handsome prince who expresses interest in the lead. For instance, examining their relationship in the early part of the story, Soma often bails her out in her times of need, but in doing so, helps her find confidence in herself. Like after failing a test, to prevent her expulsion from Totsuki, Soma stood up to a teacher, risking his own skin in the process, so Megumi could get a second chance. In mentioning this too, later on in the story during a training sequence, Food Wars indirectly references one of the most iconic shoujo series of all time, in Aim for the Ace, where Megumi compares herself and her relationship to her new coach to that of a manga about a girl mastering the sport of ping pong. For the record, I said indirectly references because Food Wars substituted Aim for the Ace's tennis for ping pong. But still, her description for the story follows the former's premise to a T. Even its title, Aim for Victory, sounds similar as well. So from that inclusion alone, Food Wars basically admits it follows the shoujo formula. One other fact deserving of a mention regards how biasing to the story, due to siding with Soma during a major cooking challenge, Megumi wound up on the Council of 10, even though skill-wise she may not have been worthy of the title. And with she herself questioning if she could live up to the rank as well, thus meaning Megumi became a reluctant member of the elite of the elites. As this occurred so late into her character arc, it doesn't perfectly match up with the shoujo formula, albeit everything deviates a little bit, but it still comes close enough to resemble the standard. Moving on to the shoujo-esque theme of liberation. Now, later on in the story, Erina essentially replaces Megumi as the secondary main character, and the plot shifts from surviving the ruthless curriculum of Totsuki to preventing a takeover of the school by Erina's totalitarian father, who at an early age groomed her in his image so that she would mindlessly obey his every command. By the way, he holds the mentality that cooking has to follow an exact recipe to be considered good, and believes that any deviation ruins the meal, regardless of taste. So, he as a character embodies the notion of an oppressive and domineering society. Already this summary sets the tone for themes of liberation, as the greater focus on Erina presents a narrative of a girl escaping the ties that bind her, and learning to stand up on her own behalf. Basically, she frees, i.e. liberates herself from her dictator of a father and his strict system of beliefs. So again, Food Wars checks off another box intrinsic to shoujo stories. Lastly, the archetype of the fragile prince, associated with the color white, who, in story, fits the description of Totsuki's best student chef and #1 seat in the Council of 10, Eishi Skasa. Personality-wise, he possesses total confidence in his culinary abilities, which projects a royal princely aura, supplemented all the more by his class rank. But when he deals with issues outside of cooking, he falls apart. Like after making a fabulous meal, he frantically worried about its presentation. In addition to that, despite occupying the top seat, his second-in-command often bosses him around. But most of all, what categorizes him as fragile revolves around the fact that once he became dissatisfied in life, he succumbed to the influences of Erina's sinister but charismatic father. Most of you have already noticed this by now, but visually, he associates with the color white via hair color. So again, Eishi Skasa's characteristics and behavior syncs up with the role as a fragile prince. Overall, as Food Wars practically structures itself off as a shoujo formula while also embodying many of its core traits, a sound argument for it classifying as a shoujo exists, despite it releasing under the banner of a shonen. Some may disagree with my opinion by saying how the series objectifies women, particularly through featuring a cast of voluptuous ladies, while also with the inclusion of food-themed fantasy sequences colloquially known as foodgasms. For those not in the know, they basically consist of a scene where when a character eats something delicious, the taste sends them into an over-the-top euphoric delirium, portraying them as experiencing ecstasy, usually in an erotic food-themed way. An example would be, like if a person ate an exquisite pancake, their clothing would burst off and they'd be laying on top of a bed of steamy pancakes, only for them to be showered in a torrent of maple syrup. On to why I don't necessarily think this turns away a female audience, which is because the series itself makes both genders pleasing on the eyes. Like one of the main male characters of the story, in his on-screen appearances, often wears nothing but an apron. Likewise, the person most likely to burst out of their clothing would be Erina's hunk of a grandfather, who has the body of a Greek god. So not just the females have what would be construed as lust-inducing physiques. Besides that too, even the men who may lack muscles aren't exactly hard on the eyes either. In addition to that, the foodgasm sequences never limit themselves to just women. They more likely than not involve cooking contest judges, which usually compose of a diverse range of people. Overall, the stance that Food Wars objectifies women completely ignores the other side of the debate, that it often does the same for the men too. So for this statement to remain accurate, one must instead argue that Food Wars objectifies everyone. To end off this section, I want to say I realize many people might argue that I exaggerated certain elements to project an image that Food Wars appears as more shoujo-esque than it actually is, which I won't necessarily dismiss as invalid. But from my arguments, I think I without a doubt prove that the series itself contains several qualities designed specifically to entice a female audience, meaning that even though it may carry the shonen label, girls can still enjoy it as well. Extrapolating off of that, I'll mention a marketing scheme behind some of Hollywood's most successful blockbusters. I go to the film Titanic for reference. Now, even though this movie comes off as a pure chick flick, it garnered lots of male attention because of a certain scene depicting Leonardo DiCaprio's character drawing Kate Winslet's nude. Keep in mind this film released before internet access became readily available, meaning this type of content in its day and age could be hard to find. So the allure of this scene appealed to viewers outside of this demographic's normal sphere of influence, which as an inclusion essentially doubled this otherwise polarizing film's audience. Tying this back to the modern-day anime scene, the industry itself has ramped up replicating this practice by further intertwining male and female content in order to maximize its potential viewership. And what I've been highlighting with Food Wars serves as a good indicator for this. So, overall, anime isn't necessarily ignoring shoujo or its fans. It's more so incorporating its content into the fabric of shonen to create a singular entity for all. For the record, I earlier said ramped up instead of, say, begun, because a sound argument for the merger of shonen and shoujo exists as early as the 90s. But first, I should elaborate on the latter's history. Now, in the past, shonen clearly defined itself as male-oriented. Like in the 1960s/early 70s era, almost every weekly Shonen Jump series starred a middle school boy as a protagonist. Akuma-kun, a young kid who could summon demons. Koya no Shonen Isamu, a mixed-race Japanese boy who wandered the American Wild West, or Harenchi Gakuen, a gag story about a mischievous boy who pranks his school teachers. So design-wise, all these series appeal more to the interest of guys. In mentioning this too, during this period, girls usually only filled a sideline role like that of a crush. In the following decade, you could say shonen grew up, as the new protagonist often appeared as muscle-bound macho men based off of 80s action stars. And in regards to having a female audience, their plots practically warded them off. Like, the post-apocalyptic world of Fist of the North Star left the impression that unguarded women will likely end up as pleasure slaves to a disgusting wastelander. Or even this, the one lady in the series who could semi-fight, albeit through weapons, not fists, later on in the story, vowed to renounce combat altogether. Or another franchise of the era, Sakigake Otokujuku, featured a scene of the main character picking a fight with a boxer. And after triumphing, the defeated man's girlfriend tried to get into the pants of the victorious protagonist, only for him to reject her advances and basically call her a harlot in response. So these 80s shonens mark themselves as guys only, by painting women as rather helpless and often in a negative light. To be fair, I should mention a few technicalities. Like how at the beginning of the decade, due to the wild success of Urusei Yatsura, Weekly Shonen Jump cashed in on the craze by debuting several rom-com series like Himagori Orange Road or Stop Hibari-kun, which genre and character-wise comes off as more approachable to girls. But after the even greater popularity of Fist of the North Star arrived, this trend all but halted. And a second technicality would be with how the rather masculine franchise of Saint Seiya unintentionally acquired a large female following, which stemmed from A, the series' pretty boy art style, and B, the yaoi bait character of Shun, which resulted in numerous yaoi-themed fan comics. So even though Saint Seiya expressed the manly themes of the 80s, it visually attracted the ladies. On to the late 90s, early 2000s, basically the generation of the big three. To start off, what stands out about this era revolves around how their stories more focused on groups/organizations rather than just a single character. Think Naruto's Team 7, or the Straw Hat Pirates of One Piece. And from this extra space, a greater use for female characters arose. And not just as love interests, eye candy, or damsels in distress, but also as actual combatants on the battlefield. Admittedly, they may not have been all that well written, as many times the story relegated the girls to the position of the healer in the back, or had to create specific scenarios so they could contribute to the war effort. For reference, in One Piece, quite often when the Straw Hat Pirates take on an enemy crew, there happens to reside a feeling out of place disproportionately weaker female foe for Nami to challenge. But despite all that, even though these portrayals might not have been 100% flattering to the girls, it still represented a slight thaw in the divide between male and female media, or at least with battle shonens. And from what it once was, it definitely improved their image by illustrating them as more capable. Besides that too, even the male protagonist of shonen became more welcoming to women, as it exchanged a moody and tough-as-nails 80s action star heroes in favor of more goofy and less seasoned younger boys. Putting it bluntly, Fist of the North Star's Kenshiro possessed such dominance that unless you already like his archetype, he could come off as abrasive and intimidating. Or say, since Naruto wrote its titular lead as an inexperienced young kid, he came off as more approachable, and that anyone, including the female cast members, could be on equal footing with him. A similar idea applies to One Piece's lead Luffy, as even though he may be more seasoned in combat, the fact he possesses an unserious happy-go-lucky demeanor allows for a feeling that one doesn't have to be on guard around him. Or at least from the perspective of the viewer. I say that since some of his in-story antics can be heart attack-inducing for his friends. Overall, the structure of this new age of shonens presents itself as no longer purely a boys' club. Before I move on to discussing the current shonens, to better emphasize this point, I thought I would analyze the works of a person who released series in both eras, and use it to highlight how shonens became more welcoming to a female audience. And with that said, I go to Yoshihiro Togashi, and his two series, Yu Yu Hakusho and Hunter x Hunter. Right off the bat, you'll notice numerous similarities between their main casts. Yusuke and Gon, the leads, both usually wear green clothing, and personality-wise could be construed as simplistic brutes, but creative on the battlefield. Slightly effeminate appearances and calculating personalities sum up both Kurama and Kurapika. Kuwabara and Leorio primarily serve as comedic relief, but on occasions, despite their emotional loudmouth ways, they often speak what needs to be said. And lastly, the spiky-haired and disproportionately smaller than the rest of the group, Hiei and Killua, both possess speed-based fighting styles that often quickly mow down their opponents, and they also come from similar backgrounds. More on that later. So, in terms of numbers and roles within the story, the casts of Yu Yu Hakusho and Hunter x Hunter sync up rather nicely. But besides that, many of their narratives match up well too. Except, in my opinion, I've always viewed Hunter x Hunters as a Disney-fied, more welcoming to shoujo fans version. With that said, on to the examination of the near-identical characters of Raizen from Yu Yu Hakusho and Hunter x Hunter's Meruem. Now these overwhelmingly powerful human-eating monsters, the former a demon and the latter a chimera ant, essentially experienced the exact same character development, where upon contact with a human woman, they began to see the value in what they formerly saw as their food. Except one key difference between them exists, being that their growths occurred at different points in the overall timelines of their stories. Raizen's hundreds of years prior to the central plot of Yu Yu Hakusho, i.e. the past, while Meruem's took place as the story unfolded, i.e. the present, both of which led to two differing effects. For instance, as Raizen had long since achieved self-realization, his in-story purpose assumed a wise old mentor role by acting as a guide for Yusuke into manhood. Whereas with Meruem's encounter, especially as the plot progressed forward, the story depicted how his views changed over time, meaning he could still grow as a character, and even though he may have been extremely intelligent, he wasn't exactly privy on nature or the ways of the world, thus implying immaturity or a lack of wisdom. In a certain sense, Meruem is a young Raizen, and Raizen is what Meruem likely would have become. On to how all this relates to the merger of the shonen and shoujo audience. Now, Yu Yu Hakusho's depiction of this similar archetype portrays itself in a way more favorable to a male perspective, as it less focuses on the relationship itself, but more so operates as a life lesson from an older man who has seen it all. Besides that too, the story depicted the lady that Raizen encountered as a mature woman, and not a young naive girl, like she could conversation-wise handle him. In addition to that, Raizen in the present day and in a down-to-earth manner rather quickly admitted to Yusuke that he and the woman made love, so a more adult and carnal description rather than a purely romantic one, which again skews towards the interests of a shonen demographic. Switching to Meruem and Komugi, now Hunter x Hunter placed a greater emphasis on the relationship itself and the emotions that it brought out, which characteristically aligns more with shoujo series than shonen. On top of that too, Komugi, Meruem's love interest, fits the mold or at least comes close to the build of the average shoujo protagonist. The naive young girl from a middle or lower class background suddenly thrusted into a high class world, where they usually end up as the object of desire to a prince-like character. Just so everyone is on the same page, Komugi came from an impoverished background, but due to her prowess in the board game of Gungi, she received a challenge from the young Chimera Ant King to play a game against him in his lavish palace. And because she happened to be the only person that could beat him at anything, he became fascinated with her. So she and Meruem, for that matter, fit the bill for shoujo protagonists. One of the reasons for why I called Hunter x Hunter a Disney-fied Yu Yu Hakusho revolves around how the relationship of Meruem and Komugi plays up the narrative of the Beauty and the Beast, a popular Disney film based off of a well-known fairy tale. Compared to other shoujoistic traits, this aspect may seem uncommon, but many plots of fairy tales actually inspired shoujo series. From name alone, Pre-Tier, The New Legend of Snow White, or Snow White with the Red Hair, so both of which directly reference their influence. And because Meruem's relationship plays up the angle of taking inspiration from fairy tales, stands as why I consider Hunter x Hunter as shoujoistic or Disney-fied. Now, I know some people might question why the theme of the Beauty and the Beast doesn't apply to Raizen and his love interest. Well, in responding to that, Raizen's true relationship within the series concerned his master-apprentice bond with Yusuke, not his deceased lover, who by the way only appeared in a brief flashback sequence, and served as a means to an end. Whereas Hunter x Hunter placed a major emphasis on Komugi, and she fulfilled an integral part throughout an entire arc, meaning Meruem's true relationship stuck with her and not anyone else. So, Raizen's overall point in Yu Yu Hakusho didn't mimic the narrative of the Beauty and the Beast, because it was more so about him and Yusuke, i.e., master-student or grandfather and grandson. Moving on to the next subject of Hunter x Hunter Shoujofying Yu Yu Hakusho, with a mutual dynamic of the older brother who looks out for the younger sister, through Hiei and Yukina, and Killua and his sister brother Aluka. But first off, let me clarify my terminology regarding the latter, since conflicting in-story viewpoints often cause misconceptions about said character. Now, Aluka is biologically male, but identifies as female, And this idea plays up how the rest of the family perceives them. Like Killua, the only family member to truly care about his younger sibling, uses the word sister as a display of understanding and affection, while the rest of the clan calls Alluka brother, or in the case of the parents, son. Which, in the context of the story, sends the message that Alluka will be what the family wants them to be, rather than what they themselves wish to be. Hopefully this explanation clears up any potential misunderstandings in my terminology, or with the characters themselves. Before I move on though, I should mention this. Remember how earlier I stated that shoujo tackles androgyny and gender issues in a more serious and understanding tone, while shonen approaches them more as comedic relief? Well, by that notion I'll say, with Alluka, Hunter x Hunter aligns more with the style of shoujo rather than shonen. Moving on to the discussion itself. Now in both stories, the brothers have to rescue their sisters from captivity. In Yu Yu Hakusho, a gang of crooks captured Yukina in an effort to profit off of her jewelry-making tears, whereas in Hunter x Hunter, Killua's parents imprisoned their young child for harboring a secret ability that if misused could spell doom. Later on though, once the family realized that Killua could semi-control Alluka's power, they sought to mold the two of them into puppets of sorts for their own use. Now in layman's terms, these two scenarios function as rescue missions, but they do feature a key difference from one another. Like Yu Yu Hakusho's operates as a simple move the plot forward kidnapping, while Hunter x Hunter's confinement more so represents thematic repression and being shackled to the will of the family. Like the kidnappers just locked away Yukina in a small room, and to collect her expensive tears made her as miserable as possible. Whereas Killua's family arranged a comfy, pleasurable life for Alluka, but limited contact with the outside world to prevent the possibility of their hidden power activating and wreaking havoc. By the way, except under specific conditions, this also means preventing the caring older brother from visiting as well. Flash forward ahead. Now after Killua broke Alluka out of isolation, he and his sibling intended to distance themselves from the rest of the family and their rules, so they can live the way they want to, and experience the world for what it is. And this aspect further highlights the difference between Yukina and Alluka, as the former's purely involves physical confinement, while the latter's more so concerns imprisonment from a mental perspective, i.e. being told who to be and how to live. Which sets up for how Hunter x Hunter Shojofied Yu Yu Hakusho, by introducing the shoujo-esque theme of liberation from an oppressive or controlling society, as Alluka and Killua escaping their family represents them breaking free of an authority that seeks to groom them. Transitioning to the next topic, but staying on the subject, I turn to the brother's perspective. First off, Hiei. Now after he and his friends free his sister from her kidnappers, he decides to not reveal his connection to his younger and more innocent sister, as he realizes that they belong to two different worlds, and that if she knew their relationship, that would only make her life more difficult. So without any tears or complaints, or rather manly way, he bears his sister's burden so she wouldn't have to. Now even though he fails to disclose their bond, he still looks after her, and if trouble were to arise, he would come to her aid. With Killua, on the other hand, his story goes the opposite route, by filling his narrative to the brim with sentimentality, melodrama, and sobbing scenes, traits that would be construed as unmanly. Plus, Killua's path concludes with him deciding to remain with Alluka. So the story forgoes the decision of the desired easy way versus a difficult for the sake of others route, in favor of a everything can work out ending. Besides that too, I'll reiterate the concept that a young boy protagonist can be more welcoming to a female audience than a fully grown man. On that note, I'll sum up this section by saying Hunter x Hunter didn't just shoujofy Yu Yu Hakusho by adding shoujo-esque elements into the formula, but also through diluting the masculinity of its predecessor. Lastly, a more anecdotal reason for why I view Hunter x Hunter as such. Now, in the past, definitely prior to the beginning of the 2011 anime adaptation, if you looked up anything about this franchise, you'd often find a peculiar type of fan art, commonly starring its two protagonists, Gon and Killua, together, if you get my drift. And I was not alone in these observations. In fact, I heard many people jokingly refer to this series as yaoi x yaoi or shota x shota. Which, term-wise, if you didn't know, these two words happen to be an anime manga subculture way more popular with girls than boys. Now, let me say this. Frankly, you can find this type of fan art for any series if you look hard enough. But because among this specific community, Hunter x Hunter art seemed particularly rampant, leaves the impression the series itself wasn't just consumed by a shonen demographic. Overall, the evolution of Togashi's work embodies how the times changed, as in a certain sense, what a series depicts or from the messages that it promotes reflects the industry of the time. So is Hunter x Hunter incorporating numerous ideas, or at least reworking older ones into a style more welcoming to a female audience, means that shonen itself, possibly at the cost of losing older fans, tried harder to appeal to the shoujo demographic. Again, the Fist of the North Star era, distinctly male-oriented. The Big Three generation, in my opinion, probably around 60% male-centric, 40% female. And with a more recent crop of shonens, I know this may sound controversial, but I honestly find them more geared to a female audience, rather than to the demographic their publishers technically target. Let me put it like this, among the newer generation, I view the series of Black Clover as the most pure shonen, since its conception serves as an homage to the classics of the last era, leading it to exhibit many of the same attributes, themes, styles of humor, and characterizations of the past. But here's the thing, it places a greater importance on the roles fulfilled by female characters. Like, a recurring joke about the franchise's Black Clover honors revolves around how they all featured the archetype of the obligatory female lead, who could only heal and cry the protagonist's name, while he and his rival did all the heavy lifting. But with Black Clover's obligatory female lead, Noelle, she actually contributed more to the stories than the rival character. Like, she had a goal independent of the hero in uncovering the mystery of her deceased mother. Her background established its own themes for the series too, and how she grew up as a talentless black sheep in a highly skilled royal family. So even though she holds status, she still harbors an inferiority complex. Plus, the story followed how she gradually learned to control her abilities and gain new ones too, which reflected how she grew as a character, going from being helpless on the battlefield to handling herself on her own, even beating the family that had previously mocked her. So yeah, even though Noelle fulfilled the role of the obligatory female, she actually had a purpose and brought new dimensions to this old formula. On a side note, I should mention, in a recent favorite character poll for this series, the fans voted her as the best character. And let me say this, the protagonist not taking home first place is a rarity itself, but a girl coming out on top for a battle shonen series is unheard of, which goes to show how much emphasis this series gives her. Doing further research into this subject, I only managed to find 2 other cases of a female character ranking as the best from an official Shonen Jump poll. Power from Chainsaw Man poll number 1, and Bleach's Rukia in poll number 7, which actually released from a databook instead. Now, a well-written, more than just a love interest female character doesn't automatically classify a story as a shoujo, far from it. But its inclusion suggests that it as a work doesn't want to just be a boys' club, and that it wants the girls to feel like they have something in the story for them as well. Moving on to the next newer shonen in My Hero Academia. Now, unless you lived under a rock for the past half-decade or so, you'll know how this series has been popular with the shipping community, particularly the boy-on-boy shipping community. Again, I repeat, this subculture usually consists of just the ladies. Like, if you just look up My Hero Academia in general, not even some specified term, you'll rather quickly find material supporting my claims. Now, I will say this could be a loud minority of the fanbase, but at the same time, the story itself doesn't outright reject this perception, and actually kind of embraces it. Like, later on the story, after its protagonist Deku overcomes a sullied anti-hero phase, to symbolically represent him being cleansed of his spiritual impurities and returning to normal, the author illustrated a scene of the other boys in his class bathing him during a shower together. Now, this isn't exactly what the shippers want, but it's definitely throwing them a bone. Plus, for all intents and purposes, it's not too far off from what they actually desire. Shippers aside, My Hero Academia contains numerous other elements that attract the shoujo eye, such as with the character arcs of several of Deku's female classmates, like Hyokujiro having to come out and tell her parents that she wants to be a hero instead of taking up the family profession, or with Momo's insecurities after a poor performance at the sports festival. Also, shoujo stories typically express more emotions than shonens, and in that category, My Hero Academia goes well beyond the normal shonen. Like, it garnered an infamous reputation for how much the male characters cry. Up next, The Promised Neverland. Right off the bat, I should say this series stars a girl protagonist, who refers to the first villain as Mother. So the story heavily centers around the relationship between 2 females, which is a rarity for shonens. Since audience-wise, because they target a demographic for boys, they almost always feature a male lead. The only recurring exceptions would be with ones that deal in matters of romance, which often technically star a male lead, but they usually just come off as bland and generic in the end, thus leading his more interesting love interest to steal the spotlight away from him and assume the status as the main character. Genre-wise, The Promised Neverland does not fall under this category, and if anything, it would align the most with horror, which to the average eye, many people might dismiss as unshoujo, but for those who don't know, the range of shoujos travels beyond the confines of melodramas, magical girls, and stories about boys kissing each other, and actually dabbles in a horror subculture. Believe it or not, legendary horror icon Junji Ito actually released several of his series through shoujo magazines. So that's why I argue it is fair game to view The Promised Neverland as shoujo, or at least shoujoistic. With that said though, I wish to compare it to a horror anime listed as a shoujo, titled The Curse of Kazuo Umezo. Before I get going with that, let me just warn everyone that this comparison will contain spoilers for both series. Now, the plot of The Promised Neverland begins at a seemingly idyllic orphanage where everyone gets along, but after the adoption of a young resident, the female lead stumbles upon a dark secret that a group of unknown monsters use their orphanage as a farm to raise all the children as livestock, with the intention of eating them. On to the first part of the Curse of Kazuo Umezo OVA, which opens up at a Japanese high school, where the female protagonist of the story develops a fascination for an attractive new female transfer student, particularly because of her beauty. Later on in the day, the lead notices a strange growth metastasizing on her neck. Over the next few days, the protagonist begins to feel under threat while sleeping, so to uncover the truth about this situation, she requests a friend record her while she sleeps. Only for when she awakens, she finds her friend unwilling to communicate with her, and discovers that the new transfer student has been sent to the hospital, leading the protagonist to watch her recordings. And much to her surprise, she learns that at night her growth turns into a monster and consumes the beauty of others. Getting straight to the point, these stories overlap in how they focus on monsters eating people, as well as learning of it through a shocking revelation. But what makes these two works all the more similar involves how they revolve around the horror of the unknown, rather than a scary but direct enemy, i.e. not zombies or a knife-wielding madman, but a not-yet-to-be-a-threat entity lurking in the darkness. Like The Promised Neverland, at least in Season 1, obscures the identity of the monsters and reveals little about the society outside the orphanage. And with The Curse of Kazuo Umezo, the viewpoint tricks the audience into thinking that some external force, likely the new transfer student, threatens the protagonist, only for it to turn out that the protagonist torments others and herself instead. Basically, the unknown begins in the darkest recesses of one's own mind. So again, because this newer horror shonen overlaps with an older horror-themed shoujo, stand is why I think it's fair to perceive the former as shoujoistic, or at least say the demographics are becoming more interchangeable. On that note, I want to go off on a bit of a tangent. Of course, these series share another similarity in how a girl leads the cast, and they both emphasize the narrative of how a female perceives another, while playing up themes of false appearances in the process. Like The Promised Neverland forces its protagonist to act nicely to a woman who she knows is leading everyone to the slaughter, and Kazuo Umezo focuses on how a seemingly innocent girl's subconscious envy of a classmate indirectly spawns a monster. First off, one of the complaints about anime's alleged disrespect for shoujo and preference towards shonen that actually partially inspired me to write this video involved an image post listing all the shonen anime adaptations of the past few years versus the shoujos, which ratio-wise would probably end up around 70 shonens versus 20 shoujos. But from this list I found noticeably absent in the shoujo category, the horror-themed anime The Junji Ito Collection, several of which individual self-contained stories released in shoujo magazines. And the same goes for its OVA spin-off Tomie, which debuted in the monthly Halloween horror shoujo magazine. To be perfectly accurate, I should mention on myanimelist.com, it describes the latter anime as for a josei demographic, i.e. series marketed to women in their early adulthood, which as a recategorization, I think this change stems from it being a bit more graphic than its manga counterpart. But still, it originates from a shoujo magazine. Now, even though adding in these two series fails to make even a small dent in the ratio of recently released shonen versus shoujo list, I still felt like this oversight deserved a mention. In saying that though, approaching this topic from the other end of the debate, I call into question the legitimacy of some of these entries technically classifying as shonens. With that said, I pivot to the next area of discussion, concerning a series' intended audience versus their actual fan base. And with that, I go to the franchise of The Prince of Tennis, which recently released a new season of its continuation series, aptly named The Prince of Tennis 2. Now this franchise began in the magazine of Weekly Shonen Jump in the late 90s, so technically it classifies as a shonen marketed towards boys. But oddly enough, its subject matter and its pretty boy cast ended up earning this series a larger female fan base than male, which as the story continued on, the franchise itself totally embraced. Like the credit sequence for The Prince of Tennis 2 on a visual level looked like a K-pop music video, and featured scenes of the male members of the cast in skimpy swimsuits posing. One moment in particular depicted one of them choking on what resembles a cucumber. You can probably guess the innuendo there if you get my drift. So, all in all, this series definitely feels like it's aiming for a female audience instead. Returning to the list I mentioned earlier. Now the seasons for The Prince of Tennis 2 either release after the upload for this list, or before the examined range of its allotted time span. But if it did make the cut, the person who created this list likely would have inserted it into the shonen category, when, because of its actual fan base and content, it belongs more in the shoujo section. Similarly, a series that I've heard referred to as one of the greatest shoujo animes in Princess Tutu falls under this distinction as well, where its manga, which actually serialized after its anime began, released in a shonen magazine, thus technically lumping in its basis anime in that classification as well. But again, much of its actual content seems more suited to a shoujo magazine. For instance, one could summarize it as a magical girl series infused with ballet, while also taking place in a fantasy world based off of Hans Christian Andersen's literary fairy tale, The Ugly Duckling. In addition to that, Princess Tutu includes such archetypes as the naive young girl protagonist, the white-haired fragile prince as a love interest, and the refined high-status female rival. Besides that too, the story follows themes of breaking away from predestined roles and structures of control. Like the protagonist of the story becomes a magical girl to escape the fate of the ugly duckling, and the other two characters I mentioned have authority figures influencing their fairy actions as well, if not leading them to fulfill a specific role. On top of that too, the series frequently utilizes motifs of in-motion gears and automatons, mechanisms designed to operate in a set motion, which symbolically syncs up with fate and with how the characters have predestined roles. To present a counter-argument to my own, one could call Princess Tutu a deconstruction of the magical girl genre, in part due to some darker undertones, and with not every character achieving their fairy tale ending, but even then, it still follows the shoujo mold with relatively minor deviation. Plus, if something obeyed the formula perfectly, then it would probably seem too unoriginal or generic. So, some minor liberties in its construction shouldn't automatically delegitimize it as a shoujo. Back to the analysis of the shoujofication of recent series. But next, I go to a modern rendition of a seinen classic, series for young adult males, to show how not even they have escaped this trend, in Lupin the Third Part 6. To move through this a little bit quicker, I'll list a few episode plots from the later half of this season. To begin, the story revealed how a woman named Tomoe taught the titular lead everything he knew. Next, a two-parter about a female-led gang of bank robbers. Then a narrative about a female politician fighting corruption. After that, a woman joined Zenigata's police crew, followed by a female CEO/fan of Lupin challenging him to successfully rob her security company. Two separate episodes about lady adventurers. Then one about a lady fashion designer. Next, a girl fantasizing about Fujiko being a mermaid and Lupin and crew serving as her suitors, followed by an old female partner of Fujiko's returning for one last score. Then, after that, a tangential tale about a college-age girl visiting her mother's homeland, only to learn of a history of abuse. And finally, Part 6 concluded with a female assassin seeking vengeance against her former teacher. If you haven't noticed by now, a common thread links all these various plots together, being that they all center around a woman. And in a very shoujo-esque way. The only ones that could be construed as semi-male-oriented would be the gang of robbers, since it's more action-packed, and the female CEO, because she comes off as a cute fangirl, which can appeal to male desires. But other than that, every other plotline seemed female-oriented. In mentioning this too, the episode about the girl viewing Fujiko as a mermaid, on description alone, in my opinion, that sounds like one of the most shoujo things I've ever heard. Now, since mermaid Fujiko looks very attractive, you can say it appeals to men in that sense, but plot-wise it's incredibly shoujoistic. As it views everything through a romantic fairy tale lens, female focus comes from a working-class fishing background, and her encountering the glamorous Fujiko Mine serves as her first exposure to high-class society. I know some may critique my observations by claiming that only the latter half of Part 6 constantly spotlighted female characters, and that I overlooked how this season opened up by revolving around a modern-day interpretation of Sherlock Holmes. Which by my prior logic means that since said focus is male, equates to targeting a male demographic, thus implying Lupin the Third Part 6 to be a 50-50 split between a male and female audience. As you can all guess, I disagree with that stance, and maintain my own, because even though Sherlock Holmes received a great deal of screen time, in story he truly isn't the main character of the plot, which instead goes to his adopted daughter Lily, who actually experiences the bulk of the character development for the season. For instance, most of Part 6 centered around her proving herself to her adoptive father, and also overcoming prior trauma. Even this too, the antagonist of the first half actually hunted her instead of Sherlock Holmes, because she witnessed a murder. So these reasons cement my rationale for why I view even the beginning of Lupin the Third Part 6 as more of a shoujo instead of a pure seinen. To close out this subject, a good way to summarize this whole debate would be by saying the industry, or possibly even the audience themselves for that matter, has narrowed the definition for what it means to be a shoujo, that has more so become a genre rather than a demographic, such as with the ignoring of horror shoujos, and pretending like they aren't within the spectrum, or with how in many cases, deviating from the script / adding in slightly out their qualities into the formula, a la dark fantasy magical girls, automatically loses a series its certified shoujo status. Whereas shonen has broadened its spectrum for what it means to be a shonen to the point that it's almost become more of an arbitrary label rather than a demographic. Quite frankly, it's an amorphous blob now. Food Wars incorporating aim for the ace and shoujo-esque elements into its plot. Still a shonen, no questions asked. The Promised Neverland starring a female lead, no problem. A magical girl series following 95% of the shoujo playbook, welcome aboard. In all honesty, the eligibility for serialization in male-oriented magazines has expanded so much that most action shoujos of the past would likely qualify as shonens now. Such as Blue Sonnet, a story where psychics, primarily girls, battle against giant robots and each other, all while escaping organizations bent on controlling them. Or with the iconic Sukeban Deka, sometimes referred to as Delinquent Detective, which featured a female high school delinquent turned crime fighter taking down corrupt institutions. So yeah, by today's standards, both of these series would fit comfortably in with modern shonens. To further support my claim of the narrowing of shoujo and the broadening of shonen, I want to mention a real-world event pertaining to the reaction of Viz Media placing the manga of Romantic Killer into its Shoujo Beat catalog. For those who don't know, in Japan this series released through Shonen Jump Plus, and its story consists of a teenage girl who would rather stay home all day and play video games, forced by the world to assume the role of a shoujo protagonist, which she resists at every turn. Basically, its plot parodies or deconstructs their traditional shoujo formula. Now, this inclusion into Shoujo Beat upset many purists, as since it released through Shonen Jump Plus, which also releases the newest addition to the iconic shoujo franchise Boys Over Flowers, they interpret it as shonen invading their personal space. Several of them uttered statements about how just because a series stars a girl and revolves around romance doesn't automatically classify it as a shoujo. An article even compared it to a similar shonen story titled The World God Only Knows, whose story focused on a male gamer essentially forced into the role of a visual novel dating simulator protagonist. To say this, you can find a shoujo equivalent to most of their defenses. Under the logic of a shonen can feature a female protagonist and revolve around romance, and still count as a shonen, couldn't from the opposite perspective you argue that a male could lead a romance-themed shoujo and still classify as such? Maybe The World God Only Knows should be interpreted as a shoujo instead. They say since Romantic Killer's female protagonist resisted many shoujo qualities, she should not be considered as such. But was that not also the case for the popular shoujo stories A Wallflower? Where after dealing with rejection, its female lead turned away from shoujoistic qualities like beauty and romance. Again, they said since it resembled a shonen story, it should be seen as shonen. But from the point of view I put forward, it has more in common with a shoujo story. So by their logic, should it be perceived as a shoujo? Even if one remarks Romantic Killers released through Shonen Jump Plus, well, so did the new Boys Over Flowers, so branding doesn't necessarily reflect content or audience. From my perspective, I'm not lumping Romantic Killer into either demographic, but I'm just using this point to highlight how quickly some shoujo fans came out in full force to exclude something that at least borders on shoujo, which backs up my stance that shoujo has narrowed into a more restrictive genre, while shonen has become more of a loosely structured amorphous blob. On that note, I want to briefly interject this in. Those same fans comment how so few shoujos receive adaptations, but to respond to that, I have to say, they hold its eligibility to such a strict definition that barely anything meets the requirements. Whereas since shonen has little to no parameters, everything falls within its boundaries. So that's why on a comprehensive no room for middle ground list, it'll appear like there's a disproportionate amount of boys anime to ones for girls. Transitioning to the next subject, pertaining to the evolution of anime as a whole. But first off, let me say I understand why shoujo fans might not be partial to the idea of their content appearing like a limb to shonen rather than its own thing. But as with any medium, for it to continue, it is to profit from its initial investment. And it's just that shonen simply outsell shoujo series. Like if you monitor the top 10 sales charts, monthly or yearly, shonens or seinen almost always outperform the competition. So that's why they receive the anime adaptations. Even historically, shonen and seinen dominate when compared to shoujo. For example, Wikipedia compiled a list of all manga series that broke 20 million in volume sales, which as of today totals up to 184 entries, and among them, only 21 bear the shoujo stamp. So percentage-wise, a relatively low number. Based on those rankings, that partly accounts for why it may seem like more older shonen series receive reboots than shoujos, since they simply perform better. So again, it's not necessarily industry-wide favoritism, but more so who produced the best results. With that said though, I still maintain the stance that the success of shonen manga stems from better adapting to the evolving market than shoujo. Again, I repeat, after the success of Urusei Yatsura, the number of rom-coms releasing sharply rose. Then, when the popularity of Fist of the North Star blew everything else out of the water, then manly anime increasingly popped up. Then, when that phase slowed down and series like Roku Denashi Blues and Slam Dunk assumed the throne, suddenly stories about teenage delinquents became all the rage. Since I already covered what happens next, I think you get the point. So because shonens pursue the more trendy and lucrative path, That propels it to the top of the market, thus incentivizing additional material, such as anime adaptations. To the credit of shoujo manga, it deserves praise and recognition in the sense that it gives its audience what they want, while staying true to its own core values, something which shonen can't exactly brag about. But at the same time, because shoujo walks this limited, but for all intents and purposes more honorable path, that raises the difficulty in reaching the necessary number of fans to garner an anime adaptation, unless said work already belongs to an established franchise where name alone produces results. Since many shoujo fans see themselves as forsaken by the industry, I want to show them the perspective of another audience that oftentimes feels like they received the short end of the stick in, believe it or not, the fans of shonen. Let me put it like this. Since the brand evolves and adopts a new current-day trend, that indirectly spawns separate generations within shonen, all of which embodying different qualities, like characterization, themes, and types of humor. And because of that wide umbrella, the term shonen will take on separate meanings depending on whatever series the viewer consumes. Now, even though the label of shonen continuously expands, their individual generations don't. And once the new trend arrives, the old ones and what they represent get left behind, and they don't come back, or at least in the same style as before. Like, if you prefer the older shonens that tell tales about masculine honor and feature muscle-bound protagonists who ooze confidence and fearlessness, you're not going to feel at home with this new era style, as they often covered stories about younger and more sensitive kids, require a contrived and frequently poorly written female character, and present their leads as hyper-idealistic dreamers who usually come off as socially awkward. So basically, if the shonens from a generation or so earlier got you started in the medium, you're gonna feel like the industry betrayed you, because of over time how much it has changed and cast off the old practices. A rebuttal to this statement will be how some more popular older franchises receive decades later continuations. Dragon Ball Super, for example, so they technically don't disappear or vanish. But here's the thing, they don't maintain the spirit of the past, and in the process, they generally tarnish its image. Admittedly, this may be more anecdotal to me and the people I interact with, but more often than not, I find that the longtime fans of Dragon Ball actually hate Super and what the franchise has become. Let me put it like this, during the Z era of Dragon Ball, its protagonist Goku had become a master of combat and could solve his own problems, essentially a responsible adult, but Super regressed him to a mere student of an androgynous master, so he lost his dominance, and essentially became an irresponsible child. Next, Super lost all the tension of Z, as it now more emphasized comedy-driven slice-of-life material, like how in the film Battle of the Gods, 8 decades later movie sequel, a situation forced a formerly prideful Vegeta to dance for the entertainment of a deity, which by the way just paints him as cringy and socially awkward. In addition to that too, most of the series' actual combat occurred during tournaments that barred killing, so it lacked the element of danger around every corner. And that same stipulation caused the new villains to come off as antagonists due to circumstance, rather than actually feeling like they're threatening, meaning they too lost their edge. In essence, Super infantilized or toned down everything about its predecessor series. Last but not least, this continuation turned the franchise's most masculine character, Broly the legendary Super Saiyan, into a girl, one that under normal circumstances fears combat. In addition to that, the new legendary Super Saiyan bears little to no resemblance to her normal state. Broly bulked up from a muscular 7-foot-tall man to an even more ripped 9-foot-tall man, meaning his transformation feels within reason, whereas his Dragon Ball Super equivalent went from a scrawny noodly-armed 5-foot-tall girl to the Hulk, which appearance-wise just seems inconsistent, and creates an impression that this character serves as a shoehorned-in reference to the past. So neither personality or ability-wise did she earn the right to walk in his shoes, thus inserting her, i.e. this archetype, into the role of the poorly integrated obligatory female character. What I'm getting at is, even though it may appear like Shonen tossed the old-style series a bone with entries like this, it actually disrespected their spirit, and altered them to fit the modern mold. Hence why many Shonen fans feel shafted by the anime industry. To say this as well, I'm not implying that shoujo stagnated and just regurgitates the same story over and over again. If you study the medium, you'll notice how older series like Dear Brother and The Bride of Demos consist of more scandalous stories with darker undertones, while the ones of the 2000s era, Fruits Baskets and Ouran High School Host Club, presented themselves as more whimsical and lighthearted. So some differences do exist. But with that, I voiced that shoujo better retained its core principles, and that the fans of the past could still appreciate the content of the present. Like the OVA for The Bride of Demos and the Fruits Baskets anime, both examine a seemingly ideal family with severe underlying issues. And Dear Brother and Ouran High School Host Club both portray their leads as almost doll-like to a high-status figure. So yeah, even though there may be tonal differences between the generations, their actual content still appeals to their intended audience. With that said though, to those watching, I wish to pose a question of what's more disrespectful. Something that may receive fewer adaptations, but what does release remains faithful to its identity. Or one that frequently gets adapted, but in trying to reach a wider audience, spreads itself so thin that it doesn't even satisfy its own target demographic. I leave everyone to ponder that themselves. Moving on, but staying on the subject of how anime evolves, I want to demonstrate how many of the grievances aired against modern shoujo can also apply to other types of anime as well, particularly the popular ones of the past. And with that, I'll be using Mecha as my reference. But first off, I bet some people may deem this an unfair comparison, since Mecha classifies as a genre, and shoujo counts as a demographic instead. But I see this as fair because the importance of mecha anime transcends just a classification. Like a solid argument for Gundam laying the foundations of pop culture anime exists, and other franchises like Mazinger and Neon Genesis Evangelion revolutionized the medium, if not altered the course of the industry. So, since mecha proved itself a staple of anime, elevates it to a level beyond just genre. Onto the actual discussion. To begin, I've heard many claim that the number of shoujo animes per year has decreased, and that the only type to receive mainstream attention/adaptations primarily consisted of reboots of the classics, such as Sailor Moon Crystal or Fruits Basket's 2019. Well, to respond to that, the only mecha series to garner any significant traction over the past few years would be Evangelion 3+1, basically a sequel to a franchise's rebooting. By the way, I should also say that the number of mecha series per year has also significantly dropped. Secondly, many have expressed disgust at how the only consistently released shoujo series would be the yearly new Precure. Again, the same applies to mecha, where the only constant you can count on would be the yearly new entry into the Gundam franchise. Third, I've heard many people complain about how iconic shoujo franchises can go untouched for decades till they receive a new adaptation. This year's case was Tokyo Mew Mew New. Similarly, mecha fans disliked how the Getter Robo franchise went dark after 2000's Shin Getter Robo, and it took till late 2021 for a new entry in Getter Robo Arc to release. So again, many of the grievances against the treatment of shoujo anime have an equivalent in mecha too. Continuing on with the same idea, but more from an image and content perspective rather than a specific series. Now, a frequent complaint against the trajectory of modern magical girls series, a genre often tied to shoujo, regards how many of them have abandoned their more innocent roots and assumed darker and more gimmicky tendencies. A prominent example of this would be with how Puella Magi Madoka Magica implemented a tragic dark fantasy vibe into its tone. And because among the medium this practice has become more common, many old-school magical girl fans view this as corrupting the nature of the genre. With mecha, a similar but admittedly not as drastic idea has taken root in its image as well. Let me put it like this. When you hear mecha, you think piloting giant robot mobile suits. But lately, if you look it up as a genre, you'll notice more and more that anything robot-related categorizes as such. For instance, the popular recent series of 86, which primarily concerns futuristic tank warfare, falls under this distinction as well. Or, in the mid-2010s, anime experienced a phase commonly featuring cute girls wearing scantily clad magic-infused mechanical battle armor, usually wielding laser weapons or hover wings, which somehow still classifies as mecha, even though it's more accessory-based rather than related to robots. So, with these two examples for mecha and the darker magical girls series, by definition they aren't technically incorrectly classified as such, but it feels like they lose their identities with its direction. This next complaint against the modern shoujo scene semi-contradicts the last point, but since I hear it uttered on occasions, I thought I would address it anyways. And it pertains to how the demographic, at least for anime, swerved away from the more mature teen melodramas, and more towards the kid-friendly magical girl series. Breaking away from mecha and cutting straight to the chase, remember how earlier I stated that shonen fans feel unsatisfied with its current state? Because of how it shifted away from in-charge men to focusing more on inexperienced high school boys? Well, that essentially mimics the reason for why shoujo fans feel wronged by the industry, as they both tone down their content to appeal to a wider audience. So basically, both camps are in the same boat, and that's why, in the end, I don't view shoujo as disproportionately slighted. And on that note, I want to say this. With the constantly evolving anime and manga industry, unless you've only recently entered the community, you're going to feel betrayed in some way or another, or at least experience sensations of something of yours being taken away. Whether it be the new trends taking over while the popular old ones of the past left behind, poor continuations dishonoring their basis' spirit, genres changing trajectories in a way that abandons the longtime supporters, or increasing censorship/fluctuating social standards diluting a series' actual content. So basically, if you look hard enough, you'll notice that to a certain extent, everything is disrespected in some way or another, not just shoujo. And to say this now, for those who choose to stagnate in this ever-changing industry, you'll find that if you venture outside your assigned or personally picked demographic confines, you'll stumble upon many newer franchises practically begging for your viewership. To shoujo fans, I opened up this video by showing how shonens like Food Wars, Black Clover, My Hero Academia, and Hunter x Hunter go out of their way to welcome the shoujo audience. And on that note, I'll switch over to the next topic, to highlight some positive aspects I appreciate in shoujo series, so that some shonen fans might discover value in it as well. To start off, surprisingly often, I actually find that the male characters of shoujo series, despite their frequent embrace of androgyny, to be more masculine than their shonen counterparts. Let me put it like this, as shoujos usually explore the point of view of a female outwardly looking at a man, they often better recognize the positive attributes of men. Again, I reiterate how many of their stories follow the formula of the average girl encountering a prince-like figure, whereas since shonens usually originate from the perspective of a male character, they often focus on the insecurities of men. Just as an example, I'll mention this. A year or two back, a person left a comment on my channel stating how they thought of Bleach's lead Ichigo as one of the most masculine shonen protagonists. But I've always personally disagreed with that stance, because in instances where a woman revealed too much skin around him, his face would turn red and he'd panic, so he would act unmanly. Whereas in similar situations for shoujos, they'd take the opposite approach, where the female protagonist would be nervous around the showing a little bit too much skin man, in turn portraying the male character as confident in himself. Besides that too, in most shoujos the male love interest isn't afraid to advance on the female lead. To back up my point, I'll cite the anime Legend of Basara as a source. Basically in shoujos, men aren't shy, or scared of women like in many shonens. From another angle, I should mention how shonen scrapping the power fantasy protagonists of the 80s in favor of the more relatable self-insert characters has also led to less masculinity when compared to shoujos. Like so many modern shonen stories can be summed up as loser in real-life man reincarnated into a fantasy world isekai, or rom-coms where a 10 out of 10 girl shows a sub-average boy that he has value. Yes, I understand that many anime fans, especially male ones, might not sit all that high on the social hierarchy food chain, and this represents how even if one feels like they might be on the bottom rung, they can still pick themselves up. But in going so hard at this theme, many shonens just wrote their characters as irredeemably lowly. Like the series Rent-a-Girlfriend featured a scene where the protagonist's ex-girlfriend publicly ridiculed him for never sleeping together, and he just sat there and accepted her mockery. By the way, events like these occurred regularly throughout the story. In contrast, I want to mention a sequence from a yaoi-themed shoujo I watched in preparation for this video, titled Banana Fish. First, some context for this scene, where after the enemies captured this story's protagonist, I'll just say their boss had his way with him. Then later on, once the lead escaped their clutches, a woman realized what had transpired, and questioned why he wasn't affected by what happened. To which he answered something along the lines of, "If I let things like that get to me, I'd have been dead long ago." A rather manly response if you ask me. Now, because of the subject matter of yaoi, you'd expect its lead to be submissive and easily broken. But in this case, this rather effeminate-looking protagonist has more hair on his chest than basically any shonen protagonist of the past 25 years. So, because the lead of Banana Fish stood up to his issues and didn't let it bring him down, means he's the masculine and dominant man, while the one from Rent-a-Girlfriend is the wimpy one who accepts taking it up to rear. In essence, this girly shoujo wrote a more manly man than this shonen allegedly geared towards a male audience. The next reason for why I praise shoujo regards how it did not shy away from risque or highly controversial content. Like in the story of Dear Brother, when the favoritism of the higher-ups resulted in an average girl rising to the upper echelon of the school, her fellow classmates accused her of sleeping her way to the top. So, was the story letting its cast engage in the dirtiest of mudslinging prevents a feeling of censorship, or that it held anything back? The series also tackled touchy subjects like drug addiction and mental illness, which added a gritty realism to the story. Building off of that, other shoujos took it to new extremes, which make Dear Brother look tame in comparison. For the record, the following aren't necessarily my cup of tea, but they serve as good indicators for this point. Poem of the Wind and Trees, which took place at a strict all-boys school, and featured a young male main character who, let's just say, sold his body to his fellow students. Or another series, The Door into Summer, told the tale of the intimate but forbidden relationship between a young high school boy and the wife of a nobleman. So shoujo had no fears of writing about sensitive material. With that out in the open, that leads me to the next reason of how the industry's evolution has affected the anime market. To begin, the phasing out of the OVA format, which the two controversial animes I just referenced categorize as. For those who don't know, OVAs are original video animations, released as direct-to-video products, which permitted this alternate type of anime to depict far more graphic content than their televised counterparts. Since because you bought it at the store instead of watching it through the television, they abided by less restrictions and regulations. meaning this format served as a good way to distribute the more scandalous shoujos and the over-the-top violent shonens. As a method of release, this style flourished throughout the 80s and 90s, but as TV anime became more and more the better option, this forced the individual studios to all but discontinue this practice. So in abandoning this format, this type of shoujo sustained a heavy blow by losing its best outlet. In addition to that, the move to TV all the more increased the difficulty for making shoujo anime, as this platform relied on advertisers and TV stations who might not like associating with sketchy subjects, which again further boxed content of this kind into an even smaller corner, and essentially rendering future adaptations of older controversial series, such as The Door into Summer and The Poem of the Wind and Trees, an impossibility. In this regard, what makes shonen appear more favored than shoujo pertains to how many of their classics receive modern adaptations, while few of the latter ever do. Part of the reason for why this is revolves around how shonen better deals with the current standards of censorship. Like, its controversial aspects can be better disguised. Like, if a character shows a little too much skin, just add a little more covering or increase the shading. In terms of violent content, just dilute its aftermath or omit the scene itself. If you haven't noticed by now, all these offensive qualities revolve around situationally based events, which gives shonen a little more leeway to conform to modern standards. Whereas with shoujos, since most of the time their scandalous aspects concern their actual stories, they couldn't as easily hide them without having to rewrite their entire plot. Like, removing the age gap in The Door into Summer would defeat the purpose of the story itself. So basically, with how the industry's standards evolved, locked out a sizable chunk of the shoujo catalog in the process. Regarding my phrasing of shonen appears more favored than shoujo instead of, say, is more favored, I revived my old question of how one might perceive a toned-down and censored adaptation as more disrespectful than none at all. Getting back on track. On occasions, one of these more controversial series falls through the cracks, and somehow attains a TV anime. One of the more recent instances would be the yaoi banana fish. Regardless though, it's still a rarity, and likely part of the reason for why said work received the okay for an adaptation stems from the fact that even though its protagonists may be high school-age boys, they wind up on the senior end of the yearbook, hence age-wise more acceptable than say something like The Poem of the Wind and Trees, which would be on the younger end. Returning to the transition from OVAs to TV, the former, if bought, could survive off of a small but loyal fan base, whereas the latter needs to amass as large an audience as possible to please the advertisers and networks. Now, to say this, these controversial shoujo series cater to a small niche community, meaning gaining the necessary momentum for a television adaptation can be nearly impossible, because it lacks the widespread appeal. So that's another way how the evolution of the industry left behind the shoujo demographic, or at least a select portion of it. On that note, now would be a good time to switch over to the next topic, one that actually inspired me to make this video, where a person stated how even successful shoujo stories struggle to receive anime adaptations. They cited an undisclosed manga series that sold 17 million volumes as reference. To start off, I'll say some stuff slips through the cracks, no matter the success, but it's not exclusive to shoujo. For example, a shonen story titled Rookies, which sold over 21 million copies, never acquired an anime adaptation either. Above that, another shonen series, and Worst, selling over 35 million volumes, went unadapted in the anime department as well. And what outsold these three series combined with a whopping 82 million, the Seinen Vagabond, which not even that got animated. So yeah, sometimes popular franchises just fly under the anime radar, regardless of the demographic. Sleuthing a bit deeper into this subject, I believe I uncovered the manga this person referred to in a series named Hanakimi, which according to statistics sold 17 million volumes and classifies as for a shoujo demographic. Now, let me just say, if I am indeed correct, they neglected to mention a rather important detail about this franchise, being that it received multiple live-action TV adaptations. One in the mid-2000s, a reboot in the early 2010s, and two foreign country versions. So again, pretending like the industry ignored this series comes off as a bit disingenuous, since its adaptation still arrived, but just in a different form. This next assumption comes as pure speculation on my part, but I must inquire, when recreating a manga, what rights does an adaptation possess? Like maybe the contract or license for a live-action adaptation prevents an animated version. Like you don't see two separate anime studios concurrently releasing adaptations of the same work. Or with Sukeban Deka, a franchise that has both a live-action and anime version, didn't release both adaptations at the same time either. The former, spanning over 100 episodes, began and ended in the 80s, while its OVA counterpart aired in the 90s. So under those notions, a strong possibility exists that maybe the live-action version for Hanakimi canceled out a potential anime. Again, that's just an unconfirmed theory on my part. While still on the topic of live-action adaptations of manga, I should say this. Part of the reason for why it may seem like so few shoujos get anime adaptations is because they end up here instead. Like, the fandom jokes about how any average shonen receives an anime, but for shoujo, the middle ground series, who certainly don't underperform but definitely don't shatter any records, earn adaptations as well, just as live-action TV dramas. On top of that too, several of the most popular shoujos actually receive multiple live-action adaptations. I already cited Hanakimi as a reference, but in addition to that, I'll say Boys Over Flowers, the highest-selling shoujo series, earned 10, albeit some unofficial, live-action adaptations. So yeah, even if shoujo receives fewer anime adaptations, the entertainment industry doesn't exactly ignore its existence, since its adaptations just come in a different form. If after all this evidence one still sees this debate as anime disrespects shoujo and favors shonen, then by that logic, it should be fair to retort with, then live-action disrespects shonen and overly favors shoujo, since fewer shonens receive live-action adaptations. But instead, I'm going to say this isn't about favoritism, it's just a case of each demographic doing what's more practical for themselves. Like, since most shoujos other than Magical Girls series consist of grounded-in-reality teenage melodramas that require little to no special effects, the medium of live-action suffices, especially since it costs less to produce. Whereas since shonens often comprise of inhuman monsters fighting in world-shattering combat, they basically need animation to remain consistent with its source, since low-budget movie magic and living actors can't easily capture or replicate these aspects. So again, I don't see anything malicious behind either route each demographic chooses to walk, and instead view it as them just taking the most optimal path. Lastly, I personally have to say I perceive the terms of shoujo and shonen as archaic, as they operate under the assumption that girls only like stories about magical girls or boys kissing each other, and that guys can only enjoy series that involve fighting or feature a narrative about a flawless beauty redeeming a pathetic self-insert, when in reality, people can appreciate works beyond their own demographic. Like, there's always been the running joke about the 35-year-old man who watches magical girls series like Minky Momo, which its own production studio actually acknowledged. And I myself have lately observed an uptick of females invested in shows, I'll say, designed to please the male gaze. Not for plot or the looks, but because they view it as a fun sort of romantic comedy instead. If you pay attention to their current series, you'll notice a new recurring trend, where in some way or another, a young boy somehow ends up lodged with a bunch of enticing college-age girls, usually resulting in lots of innocent accident-based humor. To put it bluntly, the male viewers watch it for the attractive ladies, and the female audience gets a cute younger brother type of character to have fun with. So now even anime for adult men tries to appeal to women. Secondly, even the publishers themselves hardly abide by the definitions of shoujo and shonen. The continuation to Boys Over Flowers, again the best-selling shoujo, now sells through Shonen Jump Plus. Hence, demographic-wise, it technically lists as shonen. Or even this, the spin-off to the seinen Blood Lad initially debuted in a shoujo magazine, but after its company went defunct, its IP transferred back to a seinen release. Similar instances to this occur as early as the 70s with Cyborg 009, which started off as a shonen and continued releasing as such for around 10 years. Then the series took a brief hiatus, and for a volume returned under a shoujo banner, only to take another hiatus and go back to a shonen distribution. To say this too, nothing about the story or its attributes changed between the switching of demographics. The most you could really argue would be a slight change of art style, but even then that's minimal at best. And illustration-wise, actually looks less noticeable when comparing the early years of the manga to right up before the pre-shoujo hiatus. So yeah, with these franchises, the demographic classification changed, but not the actual content of their stories. Meaning that publishers sometimes arbitrarily stamp the shonen shoujo brand on a series, not because their audiences overlap, but since they just happen to own its distribution rights. Thirdly, I want to mention a misconception from a person whose other comments actually motivated me to write this script, where they incorrectly labeled the franchise of Inuyasha as an action-based shoujo, when it actually released through the magazine of Weekly Shonen Sunday, meaning it categorizes as shonen instead. So from that, I want to say, if the people vocally offended at the current state of shoujo can't even really tell the difference between it and shonen, I don't think it's as immediate an issue as they present it as. To say this too, this whole idea reinforces how the archaic boundaries of the terms shoujo and shonen don't apply anymore, since they who seek certified shoujos found equal enjoyment in a technical shonen. Meaning that in the end, these labels are just arbitrary concepts and don't reflect if a person will truly like a series or not. To conclude this video, I have to say I did not write this script with the intention of picking on disgruntled shoujo fans. I created it to defend a medium that I feel has come under undeserved fire from largely hyperbolic statements that don't reflect the actual environment, which has pretty much gone out of its way to be inclusive and amiable to others. Now, I won't dismiss all of their criticisms as invalid. In all honesty, I enjoy many shoujo series. If you haven't noticed by now, throughout this video I went out of my way to highlight positive aspects about it. And let me just say, I'm not exactly fond about how some of those elements are becoming a thing of the past. But at the same time, I have to put my foot down and speak out when I see people adding a negative spin to this perspective, such as the anime industry is trying to erase shoujo. As for all intents and purposes, I don't view this as anything more than one of those fads that comes and goes, which admittedly, after they're gone, can be a bummer, especially if you're a fan. But some of this over-the-top rhetoric just causes more harm than good, and that's what I'm addressing in this video. Because I believe many of these blanket statements just give off a false reputation-ruining impression to people who don't know any better. So that's why I disagree with the premise that anime disrespects shoujo / overly favors shonen. Thanks for watching this video, hopefully everyone found it informative, and in addition to that, broaden people's perspective of the subject. Again, thanks for watching.